Due Process for Students by Whitney Davis, IL 694. What is due process for students? Due process is a constitutional right that is derived from the 14th Amendment. Due process for students is when their rights in education are being taken away. Examples of this include special education issues, expulsion, and suspension. A student's right to due process is the right to have a fair hearing before a long-term suspension or expulsion occurs. Only a dispute in special education can be filed for due process, not in general education. Amendments. The Fifth Amendment says no one shall be deprived of life, liberty, or property without due process of law. The 14th Amendment uses the same 11 words, called the Due Process Clause, to describe a legal obligation of all states. Students' rights in a due process hearing. To know what specific rules were violated, to ensure that the decision is being based upon a non-biased panel of people, to bring legal counsel if necessary, have witnesses or evidence on the student's behalf, and to have the hearing to be closed to the public to protect the student's rights. What happens to students who were denied due process? If a student is denied due process, he or she may use this as a defense against their case. Reversal of expulsion or suspension that was given. Emergency situations include a temporary suspension that can be up to 10 days without giving a hearing, or if a student is an immediate threat to themselves or to others. This is a quote that says, "No person shall be deprived of life, liberty, or property without due process of law," which comes from the Fifth Amendment. Due process rights. Due process starts with a complaint and ends with a decision. A lot of times, issues within the school and your child's education can be resolved by parent meetings and talking through disagreements. Individuals with Disabilities Act, IDEA, provides for a more formal way to resolve disputes within the school called due process. Due process rights continued. Due process is for disputes about your child's right to education. Under IDEA, you can only use due process with special education disputes. These disputes can fall under being substantive or procedural. Due process. This is a graph that has the Fifth Amendment, or it's a graphic organizer that has the Fifth Amendment. It says that it provides that the federal government cannot deprive any person of life, liberty, or property without due process. The 14th Amendment says that it provides that the state and local governments cannot deprive any person of life, liberty, or property without due process. So this is a guarantee for due process. Then you've got the two different types of ways. Procedural is the how or methods of government action. An example of this was Rochin versus California in 1952. Then you have substantive. An example of this is the what or policies of government actions. An example was Pierce versus Society of Sisters in 1925. Procedural dispute. Procedural issues involve the technical aspects of the evaluation or IEP process. For example, a procedural dispute may be filed when the IEP team meets without including you. When meeting with an IEP team, the proper procedures is the IEP teacher or the special education teacher is required to send home proper documentation to the parent within so many days prior to having that meeting. The parent then can agree to that scheduled meeting, or let them know that time doesn't work best for them, and then they'll work on another meeting. So if a parent or if the special education teacher decides to meet without letting the parent know, or meets without letting them know at all, then this is where that would fall under a procedural, that special education teacher or general education teacher is not following the proper procedures in place for that student. Substantive dispute. Substantive issues deal with your child's rights to education. For example, if your child's IEP is not providing them with all of the necessary help needed for reading and math. Another example of this would be if the teachers are not following your child's IEP. For example, if they have that they're supposed to be getting a study guide before their test, or if they're supposed to receive a copy of the notes before receiving a test, or if they're supposed to be tested in a small group setting or in the special education resource room. If those proper procedures are not being done, then their IEP is not being followed as should be. So this is where one of those situations would fall under a substantive dispute between the parents and the general ed or special ed teachers. Due process of the law. We have basic provisions, which is purpose and applications. Going forward with disciplinary procedures, which would include immediate suspension. That's on a case-by-case basis. This is a due process flowchart. What this does is explains the due process. It says, does the law classify persons explicitly or implicitly? If you answer yes, then you would go to the equal protection flowchart rather than the due process. If you answer no, then does the law infringe the exercise of a fundamental right? No. Does state have a purpose? Have a legitimate purpose? No, then due process is violated. Yes. Is the law rationally related to that purpose? No, due process has been violated. Yes, due process is not violated. So looking back on, does the law infringe the exercise of a fundamental right? If you answer yes to that question, does the law substantially impair exercise of that right? No, then you would go back to, does it have a legitimate purpose? Yes. Then you would go to, does the state have a compelling interest? No, then due process is violated. Yes. You have to look more into, is the law narrowly tailored or necessary to meet that interest? So is it specific? No, then due process has been violated. Yes, due process not violated. Due process timeline. A complaint has to be filed within 2 years of when it occurs. The school must hold a resolution meeting with you within 15 days of receiving the complaint. There is a 30-day period to try to come to an agreement. If unable to come to a resolution agreement, then the state has 45 days to make sure there is a due process hearing and decision. Parents then have 90 days from the due process hearing to file a lawsuit in state or federal court. Conclusion. Due process is a person's constitutional right that is derived from the 14th Amendment. There are certain procedures that must be followed when wanting to proceed with due process. Students have a right to a fair, unbiased trial. After a decision has been made from the due process, the family has a right to file a lawsuit with state or federal court if deemed necessary. So in other words, When following due process, that is going to be your last resort. The first thing you want to do as a parent is try to come to a resolution with your teacher, with the principal, with that school district. If a resolution cannot be agreed upon, then your next step, if you feel needed as the parent to represent your child, would be to continue with the due process steps. Every step in the due process is very specific with a timeline, making sure you follow the proper procedures. You're allowed so many days from beginning to end to make sure that you and your child have a fair trial. And these are my references.